Hey everybody, this is Just One Christian Lady. We are doing the Gospel of John 5-ish minutes at a time, and this is episode 9. We are on the second section of chapter 2, which begins in verse 12. John chapter 2, beginning in verse 12, and I think that we will go as far as verse 22. So 10 verses. We just in the last episode, we saw how Jesus turned the water into wine, and John identifies that as his first miracle and as something that was a testimony to the disciples that Jesus had come from God. So the next section is a little stark in contrast because it says, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and disciples, and he stayed there for a few days. Now the Jewish feast of Passover was near, so Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple courts those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers sitting at the tables. So he made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple courts with the sheep and the oxen. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold the doves, he said, "Take these things away from here. Do not make my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will devour me." And this is a quote from Psalm 69:9. So then, Jesus has just actually formed a whip in their presence and drove out these vendors who were mishandling and inappropriately using the temple as a marketplace because it was the Passover and there were many, many Jews coming to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So next, in the next paragraph, so then the Jewish leaders responded, "What can you show us since you are doing these things?" And I think this is interesting, and I think that we probably miss a lot of the context for the drama in this scene that is going on, but I can imagine, okay, this guy thinks he's somebody, right? This guy thinks that he has the authority to say what happens in the temple. So who are you? You need to show us something so that we know why you think that you have the authority to do this. That's what I think is happening. And then Jesus says something that probably confuses them all the more. And he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." And the Jewish leaders said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days?" But then again, John explains what was going on here, and he says, "But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. So after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the saying that Jesus had spoken." So again, John is creating a timeline for us, and these first couple of stories that he tells here in chapter 2 of the book of John seems to be the point that he is setting down some foundation for where Jesus established for the disciples who he was. And in some instances, what he established was something that they didn't remember until later, or they didn't understand the significance of until later, put it that way. Later on, they're like, "Oh, now we understand what he was talking about," and then John could explain it. But he's telling this story after the life of Jesus has unfolded and he has paid for our sin. But these are very intentional paragraphs and stories that John told here because they set the foundation for who Jesus is and how he demonstrated to the disciples who he was and how he laid a foundation that they could look back on later and realize that he had been telling them from the beginning things that they needed to know. This is Just One Christian Lady. We have just finished episode 9 of the Gospel of John, 5-ish minutes at a time. See you next time for verse 23. Have a good night.